I had to live out of my suitcase anyway, in my room. So that was her scholarship. So she loved bargain hunting. And every time she came to the States particularly, she would grab a hold of Kathleen Lyons and they'd go off to Goodwill or to Salvation Army. She called it Sally Ann. I remember one occasion, they started in San Carlos, one day in San Carlos, and hit every Goodwill and Salvation Army from San Carlos down the peninsula to Redwood City, Mountain View, Menlo Park, Palo Alto, ending up with Kathleen Lyons' own place in Mountain View. And she'd go into these shops and take a cup, with a price tag of 50 cents on it, and she'd spend a half an hour examining it with there cracks in it, and then she'd go up and she'd spend another half an hour bargaining to get it down to 25 cents, just for the sheer hell of bargaining. But she loved particularly pillows, cushions, sheets, blankets, eider-downs and stuff like that. And so she'd bring them home to my house then. I was living in Menlo Park at the time. So I remember one particular incident. She comes home with this neon-coloured pink cushion. And I said to her, Peg, what are you doing with that? She said, that's for you. I said, I don't think so. So she parked her pink neon cushion and spent the month with me and then went home. And as soon as she went home, I went back down to the Goodwill and I gave it back in. I declared to God, if the year after she came back and went in and it was still in there, I don't blame it. Who the hell is going to buy that? And she came back, she said, I'm delighted. I found a comrade, was the word she used. I found a comrade for your pink cushion. And she brought it to me again. So when she'd gone home the second time, I figured, I'm not going to risk this anymore. So I gave the pink neon cushion a Christian burial. Make sure it never happened again. So there's a huge big Salvation Army up in Healdsburg near where I live. It's a huge big lot, 6 or 7 acres. They sell cars there, they sell boats there, campers, all kinds of things. And every day she'd want to go down there and spend time. I'd have to drop her off and go back 4 or 5 hours later and pick her up. And she'd go through them item by item, just for the sheer heck of having a bargain. So that is who she was in her middle age. She was also a consummate traveller. She came to visit me in Kenya twice when I was in Kenya with my littlest sister, Dervla. And then after I got thrown out of Kenya in 1986, just to show them, for the sheer hell of showing them, she went back on her own. And she spent 3 months there working in safari clinics with sisters from Cork. But when she arrived in Nairobi airport, about a year after I'd been thrown out of the country, she stood in the airport, put her hands in the air and she says, we're back. She came to the States many times, and her greatest regret was the last time she visited me was in October of 2008. And she had an incident on the airplane where she was really gasping for breath, but told nobody about it. She arrived off the plane. Finally, the last hour and a half, they had her on oxygen on the plane. And she arrived here, and she was just totally purple. So I brought her straight up to my house, to a doctor, and we had her on oxygen for the week. And then my sister-in-law came out and brought her back. But the thing that was really hurting her, 2 things. She never got to visit COJ in that final visit of hers. And secondly, she had an envelope with $1,050 specifically for buying stuff in Salvation Army and Goodwill, and she never got to spend it. And she never did spend it. And so in fact, when we went through her affairs after she had died, there is still an envelope with $1,050 brand new dollars. And she talked about it many times. That had never been sold. So her illness began to develop for the following reasons. She, from her 20s into her 50s, she smoked 3 packs of cigarettes a day. Terrible smoker. And then she gave them up in her early 50s. And by profession, she was a seamstress. So she's constantly in an environment where there's fabric dust in the atmosphere. And so her lungs really paid the price. So she had a combination of conditions, COPD, which is chronic obstructive pulmonary disorder, and she had something which is called idiopathic pulmonary fibrosis, and she also had coronary artery disease. So when these happened, she was given a prognosis of 3 years. That was 2002. And she beat the odds again, like Peg always beat the odds. But for the last few years, pretty much every winter, she got some kind of a really bad lung infection or pneumonia. And so in October of this year, she went into hospital with a combination of pneumonia, and then picked up some kind of a bug in the hospital, and then developed pleurisy. And they saw a spot in her lung at that stage, and they wanted to biopsy it and send her to Dublin. She said, that's it, no more treatment, that's it. I'm ready to go at this stage. I want to go back home, I want to be in my own house. And she did. And so she spent the last 6 or 7 weeks in her own home, independent in the sense that she still had oxygen. She was on oxygen 24/7 for the last 3 years of her life. But she had a backpack, and she would drive. And so she was driving 6 weeks before she died, with this backpack of oxygen and carrying it around with her. Fiercely independent right up to the end. And so I was intending to go home on the 22nd of November because I realized that, she probably wasn't going to see Christmas. And then, as you remember, on the 14th of November, early in the morning, 5 o'clock in the morning, I got a phone call from my brother saying that she was really in a bad way. And so after the children's mass that Sunday, I left for Ireland. And I arrived in Cork at 5 p.m. I arrived home in her house at 5 p.m. on Monday evening, and she was really delighted to see me. She kept repeating, "You came back, you came back, you came back, you came back." So apart from a small siesta in the middle of it, I spent the last 44 hours of her life with her. There was a whole gang of us. She had, as I told you, she had 6 kids, but one of my sisters died in 1995 of a brain aneurysm. The other 5 were there. 16 of her 19 grandchildren were there. Her 11 great-grandchildren all paid a visit during this period of time. So a typical scene was 10 or 12 of us sitting on the bed, lying on the bed, around the bed with her, talking to her, telling her stories, singing songs to her. And for that period of time, most of it she was conscious, but she was only interactive with her eyes. She wasn't talking a whole lot, very little energy to speak. But her eyes were saying everything. But we sang to her, we told her stories, we reminded her of events for her own life. And then there was somebody stayed with her round the clock. So I stayed with her all the time. My brother Seamus did, and then there were other people who came and went over the 44 hours. For the last, from 3:30 in the morning on the 17th, I noticed that her breathing was getting really, really shallow and a bit laboured. And so we began to congregate, and by 7:30 there was 12 of us in the room, sitting on the bed with her, and I was leading her through the process of the dying, reminding her just to keep watching for the light and not to get distracted by what her body was doing or the illusions. Kept leading her through it, and she kept nodding in response to kind of what I was saying to her. And then she fell asleep for a few hours, and then she woke up very, very near the end, and she was a little bit agitated, and she sat up in the bed, and I grabbed her, and somebody else, Aisling, sat in beside her. And all of a sudden she looked up to her left, and she saw something up there, and I have never in my life seen somebody with so much awe and so much wonder and so much incredulity in her face. Whatever she saw up there. It was the light, obviously, or it was my sister Ethna coming to escort her home. But there was this transfixed look of, oh my God, I can't believe what I'm just seeing now. And at that stage, I kind of just eased her back down. Aisling was behind her, and she took 3 or 4 breaths, and she went. Yeah. So after a few minutes, Seamus, my brother, took the tube out of her nose, the air tube, and turned off the machine. And I suddenly realized the extraordinary silence. When these machines, they go non-stop. So this was her life for the last 8 years. Suddenly there was this extraordinary silence. I had never in my life heard my mother silent. When she was awake, she was talking, and when she was asleep, she was snoring. So she was never silent. But there was this extraordinary silence ensued. And we sat around just waiting with her. So then people began to, do various tasks. So I lay beside her for an hour after she died, cheek to cheek, turned off all the lights in the room, and just imagined what her journey was like at this stage of the safari, and tried to, insofar as I could, escort her on that final phase of the transition into the afterlife. We kept her at home. We called the funeral people. They came, they took her for 4 hours and embalmed the body and then brought her home. And we waked her for 3 days. So she's lying in state in her own bed, not in the coffin, in her own bed. And the girls had done a beautiful job in the room. There was flowers there was incense burning, there were candles all over. And for the next 60 hours, we escorted her. We told stories about her, we sang songs to her, and there was probably never less than 7 or 8 people in the room for the entirety of that time. And then on Saturday morning, the 20th, about 10 o'clock in the morning, we had a final family farewell to her. And then the coffin came in and she was brought to the church, and we had a mass at noon in which all of her children, all of her grandchildren, and most of her great-grandchildren participated, either as readers, as singers. Her granddaughter, Dawn, Sean Seamus' sister, is a brilliant musician. She sang the mass, accompanied by an uncle of ours, Dan O'Leary, So people were either reading or singing or doing eulogies or offering prayers of petition or carrying up the gifts, but everybody of the family was involved. And it was a typical, COG Mass, 2 hours in extension. And then we took her to the graveyard and we buried her for the last time. And so, to finish up, what I would like to do, Peg was a woman who lived life to the full. She took life very seriously in the sense that it was meant to be lived completely. But a seriousness always tempered by the ability to laugh at life and to laugh with life. Serious only in the sense that it was meant to be lived in completely, but not in the sense that it was meant to be lived with long faces. And so one of the songs I sang for her at the very end was her own favourite song. It was her party piece. And to show that even in the transitioning, that life is to be laughed with and laughed at, I want to end my homage to my mother this morning by singing her favourite song. And it's a funny one, as you can imagine, because that's how she wanted to be remembered. And it goes like this. There once was a farmer who took a young miss way back of a barn where he gave her a lecture on horses and cattle and eggs and told her that she had such beautiful manners which suited a girl of her charms, a girl that he wanted to take in his washing and ironing, and then if she did, they would get married and raise up some sweet violets, sweeter than the roses, covered all over from head to toe, covered all over with sweet violets. The maid told the farmer that he'd better stop, or she'd call her father, and he called a taxi and got there before very long. Someone was doing his little girl a right for a change, and so that's why he said, if you marry her, son, you're better off single, 'cause it's always been my belief marriage can bring a man nothing but sweet violets, sweeter than the roses, covered all over from head to toe, covered all over with sweet violets. The farmer decided to wed anyway and started preparing for his wedding suit, which he purchased for only $1. Then he discovered he was out of money, and so he was left in the lurch, standing and waiting in front of the end of the story, which just goes to show all a girl wants from a man are his sweet violets, sweeter than the roses, covered all over from head to toe, covered all over with sweet violets. Peg, my mother, who gave me the spacesuit for this incarnation, I honor you. I thank you for what you've modeled to me. Namaste.